Hey guys, so today we are going to be finally ranking all of the Conjuring movies, and when I say Conjuring movies, I mean all the movies within the Conjuring universe. So there's 8 movies that we're going to be ranking from worst to best. Like always, my tier list ranking videos are quite controversial because it is my personal opinion and it's bound to be different from yours. So just, bear that in mind. This is just my opinion. Feel free to share your personal ranking and reviews of these movies in the comments. So before we get into the video, I just want to thank, I just hit myself in the face, Hunt a Killer for sponsoring today's video. I'm very excited to be partnering with Hunt a Killer for today's video because these are so fun. It's so much fun to do with my partner as like a little date night, or I've done it with friends as well. So much fun. You get to solve an immersive murder mystery and kind of breaks up the routine of if you and your friends don't know what to do, or if you and your partner are just staying at home and still want to do a date night at home. These are perfect. Just bust out some wine, pop open a Hunt a Killer box. Now, I love real life escape rooms. Like, I love them, obsessed with them. And Hunt a Killer reminds me so much of escape rooms. It feels like an escape room in a box where you have to decipher clues and solve puzzles. Also, I just want to say that these are actually very challenging. Like, it takes me a lot longer than I think it's going to take. It's not like an hour escape room. No, it's going to take much longer. The challenge is actually really, really fun, and what makes it so entertaining because it takes a lot of brain power to actually solve these cases. It's definitely harder than an in-person escape room, but in all the best ways. It feels like you're like in a TV show. You gotta solve some crime. All the cases are fictional, of course. However, I do love that part of the proceeds of each Hunt a Killer box goes to the Cold Case Foundation, which is an organization where they try to help solve real-life cold cases. So right now you can go to huntakiller.com/possessed and use my code POSSESSED for 20% off your first box. Okay, now let's talk all things The Conjuring. This is going to be a video where I will individually kind of review each movie as I rank them. So all of my thoughts will be contained in this one video for future reference in case you ever want to know what my thoughts are on a Conjuring movie. Generally, I like them. I think they're a little overhyped, and I tend to forget them when I'm like making lists of things. Like I just made my 31 Days of Horror, and I realized that The Conjuring would actually fit into that category, but for some reason I don't gravitate towards them, and I kind of forget about them, which is, it doesn't really, that doesn't make sense with me saying how overhyped it is, because like how could you forget about it? The horror community won't let you forget about it. But I think the movies as a whole, the franchise as a whole, can be a little bit too tropey for me and just not something I haven't seen before. I like them. I enjoy them because I do love supernatural possession type movies, but there's just something about them. They're not my favorite franchise. It's just, they're fine. They're fine. So we're gonna start with the worst Conjuring movie, in my opinion. Again, feel free to disagree if you want to. The Nun. This came out in 2018 and follows a young nun and a priest sent to Romania by the Vatican to investigate a nun's death, and there they discover a malevolent force in the form of a demonic nun. So the nun, of course, not Valak the nun, but the nun in the movie, the one who's sent from the Vatican to help solve this nun's death. This other nun, how many times am I gonna say nun? Drinking game? No, don't. Anyway, the nun, of course, is played by Thaisa Farmiga, which we know as Vera Farmiga's sister, so they kind of kept it in the family. This is not my favorite role of hers. For some reason, Thaisa has like a face that just doesn't work in the era that this is set in. Now, this is more on the Gothic side, so it's set in 1952 Romania, which the setting and atmosphere is probably the best thing this movie has going for it. And it was actually filmed in Romania, so the sets are real, and that just, I think, added to the atmosphere of this movie, and the sets were actually blessed by an Eastern Orthodox priest, which I find very interesting. So the director of The Nun is Corin Hardy, who, from what I can tell, has never worked on another Conjuring movie in any of the franchise, which I think kind of shows. Now, are you sitting down? Because this next piece of information might do it in for you. This is the highest grossing Conjuring movie, like in the franchise. That's a tragedy to me. How is that possible? They are allegedly currently working on a sequel that no one asks for. I don't know. Maybe I'm being too harsh on The Nun. Maybe it's not that terrible. I hated it. I absolutely hated this movie. Have no interest in rewatching it. Seen it the one time in theaters. That's enough for me to know that this is the worst in the franchise. I think The Nun is a great example of a movie being profitable solely because of the hype around it. And I will say that this movie had a little bit better horror elements and scare factor than some of the other Conjuring movies in the universe, because just generally I find that Valak is more terrifying than, say, Annabelle, you know? But even Valak couldn't save this movie for me. It just made me laugh. It's one of those where I laugh and not in a good way. The ending, the climax, and how they kind of like defeat Valak and things like that, it's a joke to me. I didn't think it was real. I was like, is this actually happening? Is this how they're gonna wrap up this movie? I will say that the ending, though, when it ties it back into other movies, loved that, because it was an homage to Conjuring films, and obviously we're there because we like the Conjuring movies, we're fans of the franchise, so I like that they gave the viewers a little bit of that, maybe a little bit of fan service, but I appreciated it nonetheless. But anyway, they just couldn't execute it properly, I think, and they really let Valak down, because Valak is one of the coolest supernatural entities in the Conjuring, and to have her own movie, I think, you know, was very exciting, and then it became the worst in the franchise, so it's disappointing. Okay, in 7th place we have Annabelle, the first one. This follows a couple expecting a baby when John buys his wife what he thinks is the perfect gift, a vintage doll. Devil worshippers, aka the Manson family, invade their home and attack them, leaving the doll a conduit for the ultimate evil. This is hands down one of the most tropey movies in the entire series. I think every single thing was expected. The jump scares are terrible, and everything in this movie I've seen before, and nothing about it is really original. This is directed by John R. Leonetti, who did actually work on The Conjuring and even Insidious Chapter 2, which is kind of random, but he has worked with James Wan in the past. I do like the time period that Annabelle is set in. I don't mind that it kind of revolves around the Manson family murders, and, you know, obviously we've seen that done before. When did Annabelle come out? 2014, so this was, you know, early on enough where it's not too tropey in, you know, revolving around the Manson family. And Annabelle is actually the 14th highest grossing horror supernatural movie in the US and Canada of all time. Of all time. And again, this is only, I think, because it was riding the coattails of the hype left behind by The Conjuring, because this was only the second installment in the franchise, right? So people loved The Conjuring, right? The Conjuring's a great movie, the first one. And so Annabelle was announced, people were excited, and I think that's why it's one of the highest grossing movies ever, because it was riding on the hype. But I don't think anything in this movie is genuinely scary or stands out or super original or is, you know, very well executed. It's just kind of an average horror movie, and it's just kind of meh for me, so it's in 7th. Okay, in 6th place, we have The Curse of La Llorona from 2019. So this takes place in 1970s Los Angeles and follows a social worker and her children who are being relentlessly stalked by the ghost of La Llorona. This, of course, is one of those movies that is loosely based in the Conjuring universe and the franchise. Very small connections, but it's there. It's technically in the universe, so I'm putting it in this list. I think I'm in the minority with actually liking The Curse of La Llorona better than the other two that I've already talked about. I think a lot of people generally enjoy The Nun and Annabelle more than The Curse of La Llorona. However, just from an entertainment perspective, I think this one is better because it's something I haven't seen before. I really like the story of the Mexican legend of La Llorona, and I thought it had pretty decent scares. It could be that I am just biased towards scary women. They're just my type of horror, and that's okay. That's where my bias comes in. That's why my list is going to be different from yours. But just looking at entertainment factor, this one to me is more entertaining than Annabelle or The Nun. Now, this movie is directed by Michael Chavez, who also directed the most recent Conjuring movie, Devil Made Me Do It. And I know in this movie there was a little bit of whitewashing. You know, we have the main character being a white woman, so I know that there's that complaint about this movie, but they did try to keep some authenticity, I think, in it, but I'm not not really one to speak on that. Obviously, I didn't grow up with the tale or the legend or anything like that, but you can tell me your thoughts if you are from Mexico or you know of this legend. Now, this is the lowest grossing movie of the entire franchise, but to me that makes sense. I don't think it's a tragedy or it's sad or anything like that, because although I liked this movie generally, even though it's ranked, you know, almost last, third from last, it makes sense because it wasn't really marketed as a Conjuring movie. I feel like the Conjuring elements in it, again, were more of a fan service. So when you're watching the movie, you realize, hey, this is actually a Conjuring movie. Like, it fits in the universe. It's within the universe, which was unexpected because they didn't market it that way. So it makes sense. It didn't have the hype to build it on, which is just another piece of evidence as to why the other movies are successful, yet worse, and kind of bad movies. Because of the hype. That's why they were successful. If this one had that hype behind it and it was marketed as a Conjuring movie, I think it would have been higher grossing as well. Now, this does have some cheap jump scares. It has some campiness going on. Obviously, all of these movies do, even the best ones. But overall, I think it's a really enjoyable movie and I've seen it a couple times. It's a good one. In 5th place, we have The Conjuring, Devil Made Me Do It. This follows Ed and Lorraine Warren, who take on a case of a young man accused of murder who claims demonic possession. This forces the Warrens to create a defense for this man. Like I said, this is directed by Michael Chavez, who did The Curse of La Llorona as well, and James Wan actually moved down into just being a producer for this one. So this was the first Conjuring movie, like literal Conjuring movie, like of the 3, that he did not direct. I did a whole review on The Devil Made Me Do It if you want my thoughts on that, but to me, it just doesn't hold up as much as the other 2 Conjuring movies do. It did do some unique things with the story though. I liked seeing all the legal aspects and I wish they explored that a little bit more. The worst thing about this movie is actually how I feel about it, because I feel very ambivalent, and that is the worst place that a horror movie can be, where you don't feel super strongly one way or another, where you don't really love it and you don't really hate it. This movie is not terrible and it's not super great. It's just middle of the road, which is why it's in the middle of this ranking. Next up, we have Annabelle Comes Home from 2019. This follows the Warrens' daughter and her babysitter as Annabelle is awakened in the Room of Artifacts and becomes a terror for their daughter and babysitter and her friends. This idea was actually really cool, and I was pleasantly surprised when I saw this movie because I was not expecting to really like this one as much, because the Annabelle franchise is just not really my thing. But I think the concept of not all, but like multiple artifacts being triggered, if you will, in the artifact room is so interesting, because this isn't just an Annabelle movie, right? We get multiple artifacts that kind of come to life. We get to see more horror elements than just the doll, like in the first Annabelle movie, you know? And given that, I think the horror elements are actually pretty good in this movie, and seeing multiple horror creatures, demons, entities, whatever you want to call it, was really good. But cheesy jump scares here and there, that's a given with any of these types of movies. But I also consider Annabelle Comes Home a teen horror movie, which is why I think is another reason why this movie was more effective for me than like the first Annabelle, because it's technically a teen horror, which is one of my favorite subgenres. Obviously, it's not in the top 3 of my list because the other ones are just better, but this one, entertainment-wise, again, was highly entertaining, and I've rewatched it more than once, and it is more on the cheesy side, which is why it's ranked a little bit lower than the others. So in 3rd place, we have Annabelle Creation from 2017. This is the second Annabelle movie, and this is the best Annabelle movie in the entire franchise. I used to think it was Annabelle Comes Home, but then recently I rewatched Creation and I was like, wow, this movie's actually really good. Like, I think I underestimated it before and judged it because it was an Annabelle movie, because I saw it second. But then after seeing all 3, I think this one is the one that holds up the best and is just the most effective and well done. So this follows a retired toy maker and his wife who welcome a nun and 6 orphaned girls into their home years after their daughter Annabelle died. One girl explores in a forbidden room, finding a doll that appears to move on its own. This is directed by David F. Sandberg, which we know also directed Lights Out, which is based based on his original short horror, which, you know, obviously is very famous at this point. And I don't think Annabelle Creation does anything necessarily new for the genre, but I think it's a really good origin story for Annabelle. And I genuinely think that the scares in this movie are pretty good. They don't affect me really because they're more jumpy, you know, but I think the follow through is there, and generally out of the whole Annabelle franchise, it has the best scares. I also really enjoy the story of Annabelle Creation and like Annabelle's origin story and the setting of this and the atmosphere and everything, although it's pretty typical James Wan, you know, big old haunted house. But overall, it's the best Annabelle movie, and overall it's ranked third in the whole franchise for me. But let's move on to the top two movies, which process of elimination, you know, which are going in the top two. So let's do in second place, the one that started it all, The Conjuring. This of course follows Ed and Lorraine Warren, who are summoned to the home of Carolyn and Roger and their 5 daughters after they recently moved into a farmhouse and something supernatural is taking place. I rewatched this movie actually the other day because it'd been a while since I'd seen it and I wanted to rewatch it for this video, and it holds up. It's so good. It's such a great story. I absolutely love the story. It's not predictable at all, and I think it holds up. Even though it was the first one that came out in 2013, it holds up as one of the best Conjuring movies in the entire franchise. It's one of the few that is actually directed by James Wan, so I think that has something to do with it. But it probably has my favorite storyline out of all of the movies, and the casting for this movie and the acting is perfect. I love it. It's in second place for a reason, and I'll get to that, but generally this is just objectively one of the better movies in the franchise, and I hate to use that word because I don't think it really exists or should exist in the horror genre, but it's just hard to argue that. Like, how could you argue that this one isn't one of the best? And finally, in first place, my favorite Conjuring movie, The Conjuring 2. This follows the true story of the Enfield poltergeist as Ed and Lorraine Warren travel to England to help a family deal with poltergeist activity. And this one comes in first for a reason, and that is because the ghosts, spirits, demons, whatever, the supernatural stuff is the best in the entire franchise. The Crooked Man is one of my favorite ghosts or monsters or supernatural entities in any horror movie. It's definitely one of my favorites. I know they're making a movie, like a spin-off for, you know, his own movie for The Crooked Man. Not getting my hopes up. I don't really keep up with that. I don't care because I have a feeling it's going to be terrible. We saw that happen with The Nun. Valak is one of the best supernatural entities in The Conjuring. Look what they did with Valak. You know, no thank you. I mean, I'll watch it. I'm still gonna watch it and, you know, try to be a little bit optimistic about it, but generally, I'm just saying The Crooked Man is one of the best villains. All of his scenes are genuinely terrifying to me. It's only in his scenes that I feel the like scare factor for me personally, just because I'm desensitized to a lot of especially supernatural horror because I watch that the most, so it's really hard to scare me with that. But when I first saw this movie, The Crooked Man did scare me. The cinematography in this hands down is the best. The scene where she transforms, the daughter transforms, oh my goodness, I love that. One of my favorite scenes of horror like of all time. So to me, this is the best executed movie in the entire franchise, and one of those rare instances where the sequel is actually better than the original, in my opinion, which is why I was actually so excited for Devil Made Me Do It, and then I was severely let down because The Conjuring 1 and 2 were my favorite in the whole franchise. So when Devil Made Me Do It was announced, I avoided trailers. I was still very excited and I was still let down. So there you have it, my ranking of all the Conjuring movies in the franchise. Of course, I'll give updates if more Conjuring movies are released, although I think the genre or the franchise just needs to stop. It needs to stop. I think it's a little overhyped at this point. None of the recent ones have been that fantastic. So I just think it needs to like die down a little or do more spin-offs that are like more original, you know, and not follow Ed and Lorraine Warren, because no offense, but I'm kind of over it. I'm kind of over them. I'm sorry. Don't forget, you can go to huntakiller.com/possessed and use the code possessed for 20% off your first box. I highly recommend doing it. It's so fun. Anyway, let me know your rankings of the Conjuring movies or your personal reviews of these movies. Any thoughts that you have for this video, leave it in the comments down below. I hope you enjoyed, and I will talk to you soon. My camera always stops recording right when I'm saying goodbye, so bye.